Hello, everyone. Welcome to the RMET's Virtual Student and Early Careers Scientist Conference 2020. And thank you for joining us today for our keynote session on climate change. I'm Joanna Raymond, and I'm a PhD student in environmental sciences at the University of East Anglia.
And I'm Kris Boykin, a PhD student in meteorology at the University of Reading.
And we are your chairs for this session. We have 4 panelists for you today, and each will give a 10-minute presentation about their experience working in the field of climate change, followed by a 3-minute question session for each individual. Then we'll be opening the session for questions to the panel as a group. As in previous sessions, only the presenters' microphones and webcams will work. So if you have any questions, please just type them into the chat box.
And now I'll be introducing our first panelist, Timson Edwards. Tamsin, we're ready for you to begin your presentation. If you wouldn't mind turning off your webcam, we'll introduce you soon.
Yes, I will.
Brilliant. Cheers.
Hi, thank you so much for inviting me to speak. I hope everyone's well, and looks like a really interesting couple of days. So yeah, thanks for the invitation. I'm Timson Edwards. I'm a senior lecturer in physical geography at King's College London. And I'm not going to talk with any slides. I'm just going to talk a little bit about kind of my particular career sort of trajectory, and try and give you a couple of tips, although if anything, I would say my first tip is don't listen too much to people's tips, because you may have heard of something called survivor bias, where people who end up at a particular place that they want to be think of their past as being the way to get there. But of course, you know, they may have been lucky, there may have been other ways to get to that point. So take everything with maybe a pinch of salt as well. So I am a physicist by background. I did an undergraduate master's at the University of Manchester, which is a 4-year degree where you do a undergraduate and one for 3 years and 1 year of masters. And I originally got into physics because I was interested in astrophysics. Didn't do that much atmospheric science in my degree, and then ended up quite interested in particle physics. So I did a PhD in particle physics at Manchester. And that was because it just seemed like the most interesting bit of physics to me at the time. And I got to go and live in America, and the supervisors were nice, and those kinds of reasons. And I had a lot of fun doing that. I learnt a lot of the skills that I use now, even though it was a different field. So high performance computing, coding, data analysis, and so on. And I got to live in Chicago for a couple of years as well, which was really nice. And I decided I didn't want to stay in particle physics. I wanted to do something that felt more directly and immediately applicable to sort of society. Particle physics is more like a long run payoff in technology and knowledge, and it's a bit more abstract. So I came back and I was looking for things kind of mainly around the environment, because I had an interest in the environment since I was a teenager, but just also kind of general societal kind of nice supporting the world type jobs. And then I had one of those moments, those sliding doors moments, although probably a lot of you are too young to have watched the film Sliding Doors, but if you have, that moment where something changes in your life. And that was going to the pub with my friends on Boxing Day, around, I guess, 2005 or so. Yeah, 2006 sort of transition. And the older brother of a friend of mine happened to be Ed Hawkins, which probably, who probably is a person most of you know. He's very famous for his climate science. He's a professor. He's famous for his visualizations of climate graphics. Bless you. Sorry. And he said, "Oh, why don't you do climate modeling? You know, you don't have to have studied much climate science. You've got the kind of coding and the physics and so on." And actually just the next month, a postdoc job came up in Bristol, and I applied for it and amazingly got it. I sort of did a bit of climate reading before the interview and persuaded them that I could learn the rest as I carried on. And so I did. So that was in 2006, I started that job. And it was an amazing, important postdoc position for me in terms of it's the foundation of all the things that I've done now. All my interest in uncertainty quantification for climate models. Some of my best contacts, John T. Ruger is a person I still work with, thinking about ensembles, thinking about how to use paleo data to constrain predictions of the future. But the actual project itself, so it really trained me up as a scientist, but the project itself, I basically didn't really publish anything from it. So there was a series of both technical, academic and personal difficulties, I guess. And so I didn't end up with any publications from that, but I still ended up with some, I stayed in Bristol on some short contracts doing bits and bobs of things. So I was doing some writing for sort of a scoping study for NERC on natural hazards, uncertainty and risk in natural hazards, and some work on kind of a paleo project, again, thinking about uncertainties and statistics for paleoclimate. But again, they weren't very focused on getting publications, and I ended up without anything from those really. And so I went from 2006 to 2012, about 6 years, without really publishing anything, but just kind of getting jobs through, I guess, contacts at Bristol and reputation rather than publications. But it became increasingly clear that when I was trying to start to think about applying, when I was trying to apply for jobs, lectureships, permanent jobs, that, I just didn't have the publication record. But luckily, my last big postdoc was one for an EU project, where it was a big collaborative project, and I ended up a co-author of a lot of papers and leading a couple as well. And so managed to get a batch of papers out in about 2014, and then a lectureship. So I very much nearly left science because of that. I very much nearly didn't stay because I was getting to the point where I thought, well, I'm never going to get a job. I'm never going to get the publications. And it suddenly all came together. The other thing that was happening is I started to do a lot of public engagement. I was on Twitter. I started a blog in 2012. And that kind of spiraled off into being quite high profile quite quickly, which meant that I ended up doing a lot of stuff that was kind of advanced for my stage, in the sense that I started doing a lot of talking to people in the government office for science about climate science, because I had experience of communicating to non-experts through the blog and sort of writing in a approachable way. And so that kind of gave me an extra kind of something that was extra to my publication record. And I ended up getting my first lectureship at the Open University, and they really value interdisciplinarity of interests. So all my different things where I've done sort of paleoclimate, climate modelling, a bit of natural hazards, a bit of so the big contract that I got in the EU was an EU Framework 7 project, was on ice sheet modelling. And so I had all these different interests, and the OU liked that. They liked breadth, and they liked, I'm a bit of a jack of all trades, master of none, if you like. And they kind of like that because their teaching is very broad, and they like people to contribute to lots of different topics. And they like the fact that I did a lot of public engagement, because again, for the OU, that's perfect, because the students often are coming from not very much technical background. They may not have studied for 20 years. So I managed to get a kind of a foot in the door, if you like, of academia at a particular place that suited me well at that time. Didn't have a strong publication record, but had this other stuff, this other public and policymaker type engagement and interdisciplinarity. But that was a pretty risky strategy. It's difficult if you're someone that's like that likes a lot of different topics. Academia favors the specialist, as most of you all know. And it's quite difficult to make a career knowing a bit about different things. And you have to sort of be aware that comes with difficulties in funding and getting jobs and so on, and getting papers. So I still work, I would say, at the intersections of disciplines, maths and science, for example, in the intersections of science and policy, science and society, climate and ice sheets. And I'm particularly, as I say, interested in uncertainty quantification for models. And that actually means that it's still relatively difficult for me to get a first author paper because I rely on working with modelers to generate the data that I analyze. And so typically the modelers will be the first authors, and then I'm helping with experimental design and analysis afterwards. So it's a rare opportunity when I can actually get a big data set and just play with it for its own sake and get something new from it, and therefore get the sort of first author paper, which happened for me last year, and I've got something in review at the moment, sort of fingers crossed, which is analysing a sort of almost all ice sheet and glacier predictions for the IPCC all in one go, which is exciting and daunting at the same time. So I think so to kind of think about what tips I would kind of give in careers from that. Certainly when I was going for lectureships, the one thing, you know, I had lots of bits and bobs, and I had sort of reports and kind of articles and a bit of teaching and a bit of this and a bit of that. But ultimately what I really felt mattered was just the peer review papers. And I didn't focus on that early enough. And I didn't realize how important it would be and how serious it was that I had this big gap in my publication record. And not only that, but the idea that you can articulate your own ideas within that paper. So obviously a first author paper, that's easier, but even as a co-author, you know, can you really say what was your contribution, what was your idea, your independent idea, so that you can demonstrate you've got your own ideas and you're not just following the instructions of a boss during your PhD or your postdoc. And the other kind of thing I would say is just to keep asking for help. You know, ask for help academically, ask for help, you know, on science questions, ask for help on career advice, and ask a lot of different people, because everyone will have a different viewpoint and you might find different advice works for you from different people. And, you know, just to persist if you love academia, but also to know that other exciting jobs exist out there, as we're going to hear after me. If you either choose to leave or if you find that you can't get the job that you want, there are plenty of exciting things out there. I've certainly nearly left academia a couple of times, but ended up staying because, you know, for me, it's the thing I want to do, and I had a bit of luck to stay in it as well. So just to finish up, the final thing to say is if you go to my Twitter account, which is Flimsin, there is a postdoc job there where the deadline, I'm afraid, is tomorrow for climate and ice sheet modelling. And look out again for a job from me coming up, advertised soon. I was going to talk about sort of a couple of like meteorological based areas that I think are interesting to work in. So if there's any questions, perhaps I can say that in the questions. But yeah, hopefully that was helpful. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Tamsin. Okay, we're ready now for questions for Tamsin. So please just type them into the chat. I've got one that can start us off, actually. You've had a lot of challenges in changing your career path, which I completely 100% relate to. What are some of the biggest challenges you're facing where you are now?
Oh, good question. I think to some extent, I feel like one of the things I've tried to do in my career is, so my first postdoc was, I was very lucky to work with Met Office climate scientists who were working on the UK climate projections 2009. And in climate modelling, a lot of the uncertainty techniques that they were using were relatively well established by that point, by that group and others. But bringing that, what I've tried to do is steal some of those techniques basically and apply them to ice sheet model projections. And my paper from last year, which is about this idea called emulation, which is statistical modeling of a climate model of some kind. Getting a paper out helped persuade people that that was a good technique to use and a reliable technique to predict what a climate model would show if you ran it at different input parameter values. But there's still some people who perhaps need to be a bit persuaded about, you know, this kind of this mathematical technique that seems a little bit like magic. It seems a little bit, you know, they've spent all these years writing their beautiful computer model, complex computer model. How can you come along and mimic it with a one-line statistical model? But so it's really about kind of just showing that, you know, you couldn't do it without the complex computer model. You couldn't do the statistical aspects, the uncertainty, without the physics that's in there, without the science that's in there. So that idea of kind of advocating for uncertainty and ensembles, and, you know, it's better to have a cheaper, simpler model you can run a lot of times rather than a very high resolution, high complexity model that you can only run once or twice. It's definitely getting there, but it's still an ongoing conversation, I think.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you. I've got another question. If you can please repeat your Twitter handle quickly.
Oh, yeah. Flimsin. And if you want to know where that came from, it's because I used to play capoeira, which is the Brazilian martial art dance where you sort of cartwheel and things, and you get nicknames. And my nickname was Felina, for feline. And then I had a friend who kind of merged that with my name, with Tamsin. So it became Flimsin.
Awesome. Another quick question for you. Let's see. There we go. What did How did you get into a policy type role, government, climate advice, etc.?
Oh, do you know, I mean, I've reflected on this, and it's been such a random pathway for me, but it's all tied up in the public engagement. So I think it came down to a couple of things, a couple of key points again. I remember it, as a postdoc in Bristol, I saw a panel event with, she was the deputy director of the Government Office for Science, Claire Craig. She ended up with a policy role at the Royal Society. She's now moved on again. And I just thought she was brilliant. And so I then ran a Cheltenham Science Festival panel about can we trust climate models? And I invited her to be on the panel. And I was on the panel, and I actually invited a climate skeptic to be on the panel as well. And so we got to know each other. And so some of it was actually just that connection that she just said, oh, you know, do you fancy popping in and chatting to me about this or that? And it would be about how to communicate climate science, and about the science itself a bit, but more about the, you know, I had a kind of reputation for being able to talk in an accessible way from the blog. So I started this blog, and the blog came from doing Twitter. So all of the public engagement gave me skills to talk to policymakers, because they've got degrees in history and English and all sorts. Some of them are scientists, but lots of them aren't. So to have good skills in public engagement and having the empathy to know what it's like to talk to someone who hasn't any idea about the science basics, really, or only some, actually is much more important than you might think. It's just as important as being an expert in a particular area. Same with the BBC and the media and stuff that I do. They'd rather have one person that knows a bit about a lot of things that they can keep going back to than keep going to a different professor who's an expert on the specific news story that they're talking about. So I then go to those professors to make sure that I'm up to date on my knowledge, and then go and do the interview, because I know how to explain things without jargon from practicing.
Oh, that's brilliant. Thank you so much. That's all the time we have for questions right now for Tamsin. But Tamsin, if you want to answer any of the questions in the chat, feel free to while we move on to other presentations.
Right.
And
thanks so much.
Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you. So now we'll be moving on to our next panelist, Carla Denyer. So Carla, we're ready for you to begin your presentation.
Can you hear me right?
Yep, great.
Great. So, hi there, my name's Carla Denyer. I'm an engineer, a science communicator a little bit, and now I'm a politician. I'm a Green Party councillor in Bristol, where I live, and I was also one of the MP candidates in last year's general election. I'm actually going to remove this slide for now, but I've got a cool animation to show you in a little bit. Actually, thanks very much. So at university, I studied mechanical engineering out of kind of some general desire to do something useful, but to be honest, without a clear career plan ahead of me at that stage. Then halfway through my degree, I had the epiphany about climate change, about how much of a problem it is. And it was right then and there that I decided that one way or another, I would dedicate the rest of my career to tackling it. After I graduated, I moved to Bristol, having found what at the time was my dream job as a wind farm engineer. And I worked in that job for around 6 years, working with, amongst others, lots of meteorologists. And like Tamsin, I also started then to get into science communication. So I did a short course at the University of West of England in Bristol, and I ran a project through the British Science Association called the Wind Farm Game, which explained wind power engineering through play. And again, like Tamsin, I really see myself as a jack of all trades, master of none. And so I'm interested in a little bit of everything. And I increasingly realized that I didn't really see my future in carrying on with purely engineering, crunching the numbers 9 to 5 each day. I also started looking into maybe getting into energy policy consulting inside and outside of the engineering industry. But what was really grabbing my attention during that time was politics. I got more and more involved in activism on single issues, and then later joined the Green Party and got really active in that in my spare time. And then in 2015, I took the leap. After lots of people persuading me to do it, I said no the first half a dozen or so times. I eventually put myself forward as a candidate for the Green Party in the local elections, and I was very lucky to get elected the first time I stood. And at that point, I decided to leave my engineering job. Working in the renewable energy industry had felt like I was changing things, but not fast enough. So ultimately, I switched into politics because I wanted to change the world faster than one wind turbine at a time. I suspect that a lot of you might not know what being a local councillor involves, because I didn't when I first got involved in politics. It's basically a miniature version of being an MP. So your role is essentially split into two halves. One half is representing and helping people who live in the area that you represent. So that can be helping to signpost to local services, sort out problems, interact with the council where the council is being a bit difficult, that kind of thing. And then the other half of the role is contributing to the overall good running of the institution you've been elected to. So in my case, Bristol City Council. And we do that by proposing new policies, scrutinising those that are in leadership positions, and helping to make decisions for the city. So on a day-to-day basis, what that looks like is I and the other 69 councillors on Bristol City Council do a mixture of fielding lots of emails, having phone calls, having meetings with local residents, reading pretty hefty policy documents, and taking part in meetings to make decisions in City Hall. I am one of 11 Green Party councillors in Bristol. So as you might expect, I've got priorities around the environment and equality, social justice, that kind of thing. I've been asked to tell you how the work I do helps to mitigate climate change. And there are hundreds of examples I could give you, from small but useful things like securing better walking and cycling facilities, things like bike racks, just little stuff like that in my area, up to bigger victories like helping to persuade Bristol University to withdraw its investment from fossil fuels, which was the result of a campaign I helped lead a few years ago. I like to think that my engineering background has been useful in quite a few of those, whether it's my ability with numbers or my ability, which I've depressingly found is very uncommon. Sorry, other way around. I've unfortunately found that the level of understanding about uncertainty and probability amongst politicians is really low. So I think having engineers and scientists in the chamber who can understand that kind of thing is valuable. Anyway, the specific example I'm going to give you today is the one that I'm most proud of, and the one that I think has had the biggest impact on the global fight against the climate crisis so far. A year and a half ago, I proposed a motion to Bristol City Council, which called on the mayor to declare a climate emergency, commit the city to go carbon neutral by 2030, lobby national government for the powers and funding necessary to achieve that, and to report back in 6 months with a decarbonisation plan. Back then, I had no idea the impact that my motion would have. It passed unanimously with support from all of the other parties, which, to be honest, based on the experience of Green councillors on our council for the preceding 10 years, we didn't really expect the other parties to support it at that time. And within weeks, Green Party councillors on other councils were following suit, including London Assembly members who quickly got the Mayor of London on board. And then councillors from other political parties started proposing them too. And as I speak, over 400 UK councils have now declared climate emergencies, plus the Scottish Government, Welsh Assembly, UK Parliament, and many other organisations, businesses, universities and chartered institutes. And yeah, it turns out I kind of started a little bit of a wave with the first climate emergency declaration in Europe. I want to show you a little animation, so if we could get that up on screen now. This animation runs from October 2016 to October 2019. You can see the bar running along the bottom. And it shows the first few declarations in the world. In Australia, you can see one's appeared now, and in a moment, a couple more will appear in the US. And then you'll see what happens in November 2018 when my motion passes in Bristol, and what happens after that. Should be coming around now. There we go. And you can see that it spread very quickly at that point. Okay, thank you. So the zeitgeist was with us. I definitely can't claim sole responsibility for that. Some combination of the alarmingly hot summer we had just had in 2018, the early actions of the Extinction Rebellion movement, which was just getting started then, and the IPCC report that had just come out describing the impacts of even just 1.5 degrees of warming. Suddenly, people other than scientists and environmentalists were finally starting to get that climate change isn't just an issue, it's probably the biggest threat facing humanity. But what impact had my climate emergency motion actually had? Aside from influencing others to do similar, what impact had it actually had on changing policies and reducing carbon emissions? I have to be honest, that bit is harder to define. I'll start with Bristol because that's where I know best. In Bristol, my motion caused the mayor to declare a climate emergency, although he didn't do it until about 6 months after the motion passed, and to formally adopt the goal of Bristol becoming a carbon neutral city by 2030. That brought forward our target by 20 years from what it had been previously. And then a little while later, the mayor published a report that announced a new environmental sustainability board and an expert advisory committee on climate change, set out some actions the council will do, and identified areas where additional government action is needed. And that report was a positive step. I'm really proud to have kickstarted it, and it was great to see it contain some of the proposals that I and my fellow Green councillors had put forward, including an annual carbon budget and requiring all new homes to be carbon neutral. But ultimately, it just wasn't a sufficiently emergency-oriented response. It didn't go far enough, and it didn't go fast enough. And crucially, and depressingly, it wasn't actually a decarbonisation plan at all. It was a plan outlining how they were going to set up boards and committees and commission plans and strategies and start coming up with something in a year or two. But nearly a year after that report has come out, none of the concrete actions that will actually reduce carbon have started happening yet. There was also at the same time no sign that the mayor and council had really thoroughly incorporated an understanding of the climate crisis into other aspects of their work, which of course is essential. So, for example, the mayor still supports and supported the proposed huge expansion of Bristol Airport, even though that would have almost certainly put our carbon target out of reach. He resisted campaigns by staff, councillors and unions to withdraw pension funds from fossil fuels, and is planning major new house building in a high-risk flooding area. So I have to say, I was and continue to be worried that many of the politicians and organisations that have declared a climate emergency don't fully get it. That they declared because they wanted to jump on a bandwagon and get some positive press and look like they're doing something. There are some shining examples to that rule, though. Councils like Stroud in Gloucestershire, near where I am, was way ahead of the curve. The council itself is already carbon neutral in its own emissions, and they're much further ahead than most councils in decarbonising the whole district. So just to wrap up, I'm aware I'm near the end of my time. You know, I know that I sound like a bit of a misery guts here, and I'm really sorry about that. But at the same time, I don't want to sugarcoat an answer about the impact of what I've done that actually maybe isn't great news. I think it's really valuable that all those places declared. If I'd known that it would have started a movement when I'd written my motion, I perhaps could have worded it differently that would have held people to their actions a bit more. I still think that the hundreds of climate emergency declarations are a good thing because they put climate on the agenda. And frankly, if nothing else, they give the people who get it a stick to beat the people who made the declarations and remind them that they made those commitments. But clearly, the declarations themselves don't mean anything unless they're followed by urgent action. And while I'm doing my best to lobby for that as a single backbench councillor in Bristol, it's obviously a much, much larger project than just me. And so we need politicians, yes, but also scientists, engineers, educators, activists, and ordinary people making day-to-day decisions. And that includes all of you. So the fight goes on.
Carl, that was an excellent presentation. So we've got quite a few questions have come in. So I'll start off by asking a question from Arthur, who says, do you think scientists engaging in activism and or politics are more or less credible? And do you know what council colleagues at the other side of the political spectrum think of this?
I think it's a good question. I I think that some scientists and engineers that engage in activism do it with their scientist hats on, and others don't. They just do it in their spare time. And I think both are equally valid. I personally think it helps to make activism more credible. And I've noticed that there are a lot of scientists and professionals of various types that have become more publicly involved in climate activism in the last couple of years through XR and others. And I think that's really lent weight to it and caused them to be taken more seriously by the ordinary public than they might have done otherwise. That said, personally, I've been on a bit of a journey with this in that before I was a Green Party politician, I did do direct action, lying down in front of diggers, that kind of thing. And I've chosen to pull back a bit from that now, not because I disagree with that as a tactic. I think there's definitely a place for direct action, but I felt that my strength, if you like, is more in I've got a high tolerance for boring meetings and reading long, boring reports. And I don't mind, dressing up in a blazer and kind of doing the boring meeting bureaucracy stuff. Whereas I've got quite a low tolerance for standing outside in the cold or camping up a tree or whatever. So in a way, I'm just going with the tactics that I think I can add the most value in, being someone quite radical that's on the inside trying to pull the more moderate and conservative people in the right direction. But also I do feel a little bit that with my age and gender, if I were a politician in City Hall trying to argue for radical change, and I was also an activism training myself to stuff at the same time, then a lot of the more moderate people probably wouldn't trust me as much because they would see me as one of them. So I've sort of created a slightly artificial distance from direct activists in order to persuade the harder to persuade people, even though I'm really glad that they're doing it.
Yeah, that's a very interesting answer. The next question from Katie says, Carla, you touched on it briefly. Do you think 2030 is an achievable target? What more needs to be done? What can we do? That's a big question, I realise.
Yeah. I think 2030 is just about an achievable target. The reason that I picked that date in my motion is, well, the short answer is because that's Green Party policy, is for the UK to be carbon neutral by 2030. The long answer is that I agreed with that policy and I decided to put that into my motion in Bristol, because while there is some uncertainty on exactly when we would need to be low carbon, it is looking like it's in about that time frame that we need to have got rid of at least a huge chunk of our emissions. And because Bristol is one of the more well-off cities in the UK, and the UK is one of the more well-off cities in the world, and because Bristol is quite progressive and small g green as well, it felt that if Bristol wasn't leading, then we definitely wouldn't, the world definitely wouldn't get there in time. So we had to set ourselves an ambitious target to pull the rest of the country and the world along with us. And I think 2030 will be a real struggle. And I don't have the exact solution for how we're going to get there, but it seemed like a good compromise between the 2025 demands that XR are making and the definitely inadequate 2050 target that the government is currently working to. And actually, I'm going to sort of tack on a little bit of extra answer on that, which is that my climate emergency motion deliberately didn't lay out exactly how we're going to get there. And that's inspired by the first ever climate emergency motion in Australia, which also didn't. And the principle behind that is that if you wait till you know exactly what you need to do before you start, then you will never start and we will never get there. So the whole idea behind declaring climate emergency is acknowledging that we're in an emergency and that we cannot go on as we are. We must do something, and it's committing to take that next step. And you don't have to know what the end of the journey is. You just have to put one foot in front of the other and commit to resources and time and money to get there.
Thank you. I think we've probably gone over the 3 minutes. So we can, if you want to answer the rest of the questions either in the chat or we can go back to them in the panel discussion, as I'm sure the others will want to answer them as well. So up to you. But yeah, thank you so much, Carla. We'll see you soon.
Okay, and I'll be introducing our next panelist, which is Julieanna Powell-Turner. Julieanna, whenever you're ready to begin.
Okay, much. Good afternoon to everyone listening. Thanks for inviting me today. I'm Julieanna. I'm from Kris at the University of Chester, and actually quite interesting what Tamsin was saying, reflecting on about my journey, which I'm going to just talk about. It really wasn't planned. It was pretty much being in the right place at the right time, actually. Although my interest in the environment started at a really young age. So I think as children, we were really encouraged to play and get involved with the great outdoors, either through walking, planting trees, growing vegetables, collecting litter from the nearby beach, or exploring rock pools. I know it sounds a little bit like The Good Life, that most of you who are listening probably won't remember that programme. But I guess this interest grew as I stepped into my teenage years, and I started an environmental science degree at Lancaster University. I enjoyed it so much that I chose to stay on to do a master's in environmental and ecological science. And the MSc was really research led, with a huge amount of input from lots of departments and PhD students. And they inputted a lot into the seminars we had, tutorials and workshops. And I think it was their passion and encouragement, and also not necessarily knowing what I wanted to do, I guess led me down the path of undertaking a PhD. I really liked the idea that I could research an area in detail for 3 years, and I still am a bit of a jack of all trades, a little bit like Carla has said, and Tamsin, despite being an academic. So I looked around and I got an opportunity at the University of Sheffield in civil engineering. The PhD was a joint PhD with the Royal Universiteit in Bochum, and it was funded by the UK Atomic Energy Authority. It was a great 3 years. I researched options for the containment and management of nuclear waste, which I know is quite controversial at times, but it really resulted working with many companies where we looked at different packaging solutions for low level waste. So really interesting 3 years. And actually, after that, I'd kind of had enough of academia, but I knew I had to go back and work for AEA because they sponsored my PhD. So I took a year out and I went and volunteered for Rally International in Mongolia. And here we advised the Mongolian government on appropriate natural resource management for the Han-Henti region, which is in the far northeast, and it covers a swathe area of dense forest. Ultimately, the aim was to ensure that we maintained and I guess enhanced biodiversity, to try and keep carbon locked up in the ground, as well as providing resource for Mongolians, for the nomadic Mongolians. After that year, I then had to go and work for UKA because they put a lot of resource into my previous years, and I spent several years in China, where we played a major role in developing China's waste management infrastructure, which was pretty much zero back in 2000. So we advised on the best waste management practices and infrastructure going forwards. It involved lots of travel, and I'll be honest, I got really bored of living on a suitcase and sitting on a plane that I thought would be quite glamorous at the beginning. So one day I just decided to resign because I'd had enough. I was also reflecting on what I was doing over there as well. So then I went to Cranfield University, and it was all defence and security based. It was really interesting. My students were military officers. We worked with the Tri-Services during the time at Cranfield. I had a secondment to GCHQ in Cheltenham, which I guess is where some of my current research is reflected. But for various reasons, I ended up moving to the University of Chester 2 years ago. So now what I do is very much civilian, not defence, but still have an interest. Crest is a really young team. We're 2 years old. We're very diverse and a vibrant centre, like many university centres when they're setting off. It's all about the place, and Shropshire, where I'm based at University Centre Shrewsbury. So everything we do is for Shropshire, which is quite unusual for a university, and bearing in mind the background, because quite often you work globally. And much of the work we do is in the areas of land, air and water. In particular, we do a lot of research around the land-based economy, and bearing in mind land is the UK's most valuable asset. I believe it's worth about 5.4 trillion, and that Shropshire's agricultural. It's pretty important to what my centre do. I think also it's a finite resource, as we all know. It's critical to many policy areas, from housing and infrastructure to sustainable development, carbon sequestration and habitat creation. The breadth of work we do is absolutely huge. So I guess the best thing probably would be to look at the website, actually. That we've been using a lot of geospatial data recently in terms of modelling some of the environmental corridors in the town centre to try and reduce traffic, to increase active living, enhance well-being, as well as providing a better town centre experience. Could we move on to the next slide, please? Okay, thank you. So a typical day as an academic, now I know these probably, they differ for everybody, but my typical day is never the same. So there's always things which need attention and opportunities which need a response. So daily we explore new business opportunities, research opportunities. We might be asked to write a response for a Westminster Select Committee. We try and write grant applications when we can, and we work with associated bodies. So Chartered Institute of Waste Management, Institute of Civil Engineering, very much like the Royal Meteorological Society. I think we also I try and supervise students when I can and teach, and teaching takes up quite a lot of time. But one thing I would say actually to all of those that are researching out there, if you have the opportunity to actually write and publish, I would take that opportunity, because it becomes really quite difficult as time moves on. I know very much in the past, I didn't write a lot because I always found time to do other things. So if you have that time to write and publish whilst you're researching, please do so, because ultimately what we need to do, we need to disseminate and share research with communities we work with, and studying as it may be used to lead change. So quick bit about my research. So it covers environmental sustainability. If you Google it, that's what you get up. Mine's around critical materials, although I have to say it's moving away from that a little bit now. I'm at Chester. I do have many research interests, and that's one of my downfalls because I find everything really interesting. So I'm also a little bit of a jack of all trades, like Carla was saying at times. But what I've been trying to do since moving to Chester, rather than looking at how we used to look at critical materials in defence, I'm trying to look at now the whole infrastructure relating to EVs, to electric vehicles. So yeah, it used to be purely on defence equipment and looking at supply chains and some of the leakage points, all the way from mining and quarrying really to final disposal. So I guess what I'm trying to do now is to look at the growth, the use, the accessibility, recyclability of electric vehicles, but in particular the implications of recycling lithium, which are very controversial, and how it can be used in a circular economy, the implications of recycling lithium, and how it could be used in other technologies, I guess, but ultimately looking at greener materials that reduce the overall impact of electric vehicles, because the market's growing at a rate. I've got a real interest in Earth observation data and how this can be used to reduce the disruption from flooding, and mitigating the risks of climate change, improving diversity and habitat enhancement, all in the county of Shropshire. And actually one of the things we're looking to do in my team is to apply Earth observation data around natural capital assets, and in particular trying to track land use change, which in a county like Shropshire, which is traditionally agricultural, is of key value for the future use and maintenance of the land. So we're working on how we can sort of bring together that collective data, which isn't easy. So the last slide, and I appreciate I'm sort of cantering through this, but I'm aware of time. So I question myself, what do I think about most of the time? Well, I do think about a lot of things, as we all do, but actually the natural world is something that I think about, whether it's animals, ecology, conservation, people, cultures and society. And although we're very much in a man-made world, I think, we forget the natural world is all around us all the time, in the air we breathe, the water we drink, the light and heat that's brought from the sun, and these systems are really complex and complex and interconnected. And I think this interests me more and more. So one thing I think during COVID-19 in particular, which has delivered some really unusual environmental benefits. So, cleaner air, lower carbon emissions, a bit of a respite for wildlife. As I look out my window, I keep looking out of my window because we have a visiting peahen, so keeps capturing my eye. But I guess the big question is, how we can capitalise on this moment whilst retaining the natural world. Difficult, but not impossible. One thing I would say, and it's my final comment, is I think one of the other speakers may have mentioned this as well, is never to be afraid to ask a question, because we're always learning. So never be the one who puts your hand up. I'm always putting my hand up, and I can be very irritating, but equally that's how you learn. That's, those people in the room, they love imparting their knowledge and information. So, during your journey, if you're a student, always ask that question, because you will never stop learning. Okay, thank you ever so much for your time.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you so much, Julieanna. All right, if anyone has any questions for Julieanna, please just pop them into the chat, and I can go ahead and get us started with one. Julieanna, in regards to the defense sector, what are your thoughts on making it truly sustainable in the future? Okay, actually defense is really very sustainable now, but we always hear bad press. So no news story is a good news story. So in the 12 years I worked with defense and security, I have to say, in terms of the estate, for example, they are incredibly good at maintaining conservation biodiversity. If John Smith was able to walk over, say, for example, Salisbury Training Estate, I think we'd have a lot more erosion. We wouldn't have the biodiversity that we currently have. In terms of I guess military operations being sustainable rather than the kind of training part, that's really very, very difficult, actually, looking forward. But I guess most of what military do now, they're not really the wars they used to fight. They're going to be very different going forward. So much of what they're trying to sustain is around the humanitarian bit. So it might be fresh water, areas to grow land. I think they need to get some of the good news stories out there, actually, and think about the materials they use, which are changing very, very quickly. Actually, even from the likes of green munitions, which might seem a bit ironic, rather than depleted uranium, and you think about the environmental effects of DU going forward. Well, now green munitions are very much the way forward. And ultimately, I think simulations are a really good thing as well, because actually they don't, a lot of the training now, they don't use live ammunition. They don't have to be in the field. They can simulate it from a lab. So actually, when you think about the overall sort of emissions that they're saving, think about climate change, they can do so much more sat behind a laptop like I'm doing now and still have the same effect. So just brilliant. Thank you.
I might digress a little, I'm sorry.
Oh, that was brilliant. Yeah. I've got another question for you as well. What kind of systemic changes do you think need to be implemented to really fully realize this sort of a circular economy?
Sorry, say that one again.
What kind of systemic changes do you think we need to make in order to fully realize a circular economy?
Okay, well, I mean, talking in Shropshire, for example, the way that many businesses are, they're trying to innovate, but ultimately they won't move to a new business model. Many of them won't necessarily change their behavior. So a lot of it's around actually changing their behavior and understanding. You don't know what you don't know, ultimately. You know, sometimes we go into companies and we will talk about the circular economy, we'll talk about environmental management, we'll talk about climate change, but it's actually understanding that. So I think what Carla was saying actually about putting things in layman's terms is one of the things that we really need to do with not just communities and businesses, but with everybody actually, because actually those systemic changes will never be realized if people don't understand what it's all about. And frankly, you know, the circular economy isn't new. You know, Walter Starr was talking about this in the 80s when he was doing more with less. So it's just, I think a lot of it's around changing behavior and not knowing what we don't know.
Brilliant.
All right.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So that's all of our time for questions specifically for Julieanna. If you have any more, just pop them into the chat and we'll move on to our next panelist. Joanna?
Yeah, so our final panelist for this session is Joseph Howe. So Joe, when you're ready, you can begin your presentation.
Oh, thank you very much for inviting me to come along and talk to you this afternoon. I've got a number of slides that I want to talk to you about. Firstly, my name's Joe Howe. As you can see, I head up energy research at Thornton Science Park, University of Chester. Where do I come from? Well, bottom left-hand side, that's St David's University College, Lampeter. I did a geography degree and a geography PhD in Lampeter, part of the geography school there. My PhD was very much looking at sustainable development. In 1988, Mrs. Thatcher turned green. And that's when I started my PhD, and I began to consider the extent to which sustainability was an opportunity for the rural economy of the UK at the time. From there, I went to Centre Top, which is the University of East Anglia, and I was in environmental sciences for a couple of years as a lecturer. My area of research there was primarily Agenda 21, a forerunner really to sustainable development within local authorities and localities across the UK. After a couple of years, I moved from there to the bottom middle, University of Manchester. I was at the University of Manchester for 12 years, lecturer, senior lecturer, then reader, primarily looking at two different areas. To start with, I began to look at notions of food and the extent to which I was asking some critically constructive questions around the extent to which the city could feed itself sustainably. And then I moved into the area of water management, sustainable water management, and in particular flood risk management at the time, and asking some questions about the extent to which it's possible to prevent flooding, or we should be living with flood risk. For some reason, my slides are moving backwards and forwards. If we could move back to that slide, that's great. Top right-hand side, I moved from Manchester in 2005 to take up my first chair at Queen's University, Belfast. And I was there for 2 or 3 years, 3 years it was, as head of environmental planning and head of environmental engineering. It was a sea change from my previous roles. Up until then, primarily what I had done was grab research contracts, write academic papers, supervise PhDs, do a little bit of teaching, not that much hopefully, then I could really focus on building my CV around papers and pushing up my H index so I could get a chair. Got my chair, I was 39, but then I was landed with managing a rather large department or departments, about 75 staff, maybe 800 students, big budgets, and I was primarily looking at spreadsheets to watch the income streams and the expenditure streams in that particular job. That was a tough job for me. 3 years later, I moved to the bottom right-hand side, University of Central Lancashire, to head up the Energy Institute there. I started that. That was primarily about aligning the university with industry, which is something I'd been doing also within Queen's, aligning the university with industry, and I built strategic relationships with the aerospace industry and with the nuclear industry. And then 6 years ago, the University of Chester announced that it had acquired Thornton Science Park. And I've been at Thornton Science Park now for 6 years, leading research there on energy, And if we could move on to the next slide, I might be able to talk to you a little bit more about Thornton Science Park. One slide back, please. So Thornton Science Park, it's a 66-acre site. It's within the curtilage of the second largest oil refinery within the UK, Stanlow. We have there around and about 40 businesses with maybe about 700 employees, and we house the Faculty of Science and Engineering's research capacity there. So we do a lot of research around various themes, particularly energy related themes, working interchangeably both with the industries on our site and with the industries in and around our area. So our researchers are there, our faculty are there in terms of doing their research, as are our PhD students. Next slide, please. So this is what I call my field laboratory, because this is where I work. I don't know how much of this slide you can actually see, but right in the center of this, you'll be able to see Thornton Science Park. As I say, Thornton Science Park is there within the curtilage of Stanlow Oil Refinery, SR Oil Refinery UK, second largest oil refinery in the UK. If I go from the left-hand side, the west side to the east side, though, on this particular slide of companies that potentially I work with, and just give you some highlights. Bottom left-hand side, you'll see Urenco. They're based at a place called Capenhurst. Urenco, the uranium enrichment company in the UK. It's the largest uranium enrichment facility in Europe, actually. And we're doing quite a lot of work with them, looking at energy management systems on their particular site. Moving across, you then come to SR Oil Refinery, and I'm doing quite a bit of work with them on hydrogen infrastructure and carbon capture and storage infrastructure. Moving a little bit further to the right-hand side, you'll come across NSERC. NSERC is the largest glass manufacturer in the UK, and they also do bottling there. So if you ever drink something like J2O or Jacob's Creek, the bottle's been made there, and it's been bottled there before exported to the rest of the UK and beyond. Moving a little bit further to the right, you've got CF Fertilizers. CF Fertilizers are the largest manufacturer of ammonia-based fertilizers in the UK. That site alone consumes 2 to 3% of national grid gas in producing those ammonia-based fertilizers. Happy to talk about the science around that should you wish. If you go further to the east, you come to Rock Savage, and you come to Ineos Chlor. Ineos Chlor is the largest manufacturer of chlorine in the UK. So you've had a cup of tea, cup of coffee today, or even just a glass of tap water. The chlorine that's in that water comes from that particular site, so it's purified our water. Just to the north of that is Ineos Salts. Ineos Salts, if you've eaten anything today that's been processed, the salt is almost inevitably has come from that particular site. And then to the north of that, you've got the energy from waste plant, the largest energy from waste plant in Europe, which utilises all of the waste produce from Liverpool City region. And then further to the east, you've got a company called Storengy. Storengy is the largest, well, they manage the salt caverns and is the largest onshore gas storage facility in the UK, usually keeping the lights on in the UK or keeping the heating on in the UK within the winter if we're struggling to get gas in from Europe. Next slide, please. What's my typical day like? Well, top left-hand side, I'm an academic. I do some teaching, which is great. I love it. I supervise a fabulous bunch of PhD students. I have to say that in case they're on this particular call. I also do a number of research projects, some of which we'll come on to in a little while. I tend not to do so much admin anymore. Thankfully, that's to other senior colleagues to do. Bottom left-hand side, that's from the Industrial Decarbonisation Grand Challenge. Do an awful lot of work on that, and I'll come on to speak about that again in a little while. The ECITB, the Engineering Construction Industry Training Board, I'm a non-executive board member and trustee of that particular department for education body. We're responsible for education skills, standards, if you will, of the engineering construction supply chain in the UK. That's not the sector that builds houses, that's the sector that builds industrial facilities like oil refineries, like chemical facilities, like hydrogen plants and storage facilities across the UK. Bottom of that is a mission innovation brand or slide. Mission Innovation, I do quite a bit of work with. Mission Innovation is a United Nations initiative that highlights 8 key areas, industrial challenges across the world, 2 of which I'm engaged with, carbon capture and storage, but the principal one is the hydrogen agenda. And I was very fortunate to host a visit from the IC8 Industrial Challenge 8 Hydrogen Group from Mission Innovation before Christmas. Watch that, because I do think that'll be one of the outcomes of the COP summit next year. Top right-hand side, National Grid Gas. I am the academic advisor to the Future of Gas program of National Grid. They've got a significant challenge over the next few years of trying to decarbonize the grid as it shifts from methane into other gases, probably mostly biomethane or hydrogen, and I think there'll be a mixture of the two, and it's really exciting to be involved in supporting National Grid on that particular journey. And then bottom right-hand side, perhaps the thing I'm most engaged with at the moment and proudest of is something called the Northwest Hydrogen Alliance. This is a body that I launched about 3 years ago, brings together 20 Northwest companies looking at hydrogen molecule generation, network operations to move it around, and consumption of that hydrogen as we shift from methane. Next slide, please. What do I do? Well, I think you've seen there's been a transition of what I do from primarily grabbing research grants and writing papers. I still do that, and I still do some writing, but principally now I try to work with industry to help them realize the opportunities of some of the grand challenges, particularly sustainability and the clean growth grand challenge. So you can see the green growth grand challenge on the top left-hand side there. What I've done with that is to begin to look at the industrial decarbonisation grand challenge, and in particular some of my work I'd like to think is articulated in what came through in the government's manifesto just before Christmas. Number of themes here that I am engaged with: carbon capture and storage, fuel switching for heavy industries, some of the issues around the commitment to renewables in my particular space. Next slide, please. Finally, there's this hydrogen proposition, which I'm very much involved with. If you've not seen it, there's a link there to HyNet. This is a proposition to decarbonize some of the major industries in my area, which you saw on an earlier slide, looking at carbon capture and utilizing what is the East Irish Sea gas field, which is coming close to the end of its lifetime. Utilize that particular gas field as the carbon store. In the meantime, generating new technologies that ultimately we can transition those particular companies away from methane over towards clean hydrogen. The big brochure around that called the Northwest Hydrogen and Energy Cluster, which is available on the Northwest Business Leadership Team website. Very last slide, which shows 2 things. Firstly, there is my little field laboratory again on the left-hand side, and that's a significant area. The right-hand side there, you've got an oval which contains half the world's population in that particular space. So what keeps me awake at night is what I ask here. Well, over the last few weeks, it's been the issue of coronavirus and how I can work with my students, my staff, my industries to get them through this, what's been an incredibly challenging time and a traumatic time for many people. But what keeps me awake at night is that, but I'm sure that increasingly over the next few months, years, it will be this issue of 1.5 degrees, and indeed it does now already. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe, that's great. So we've probably got time for maybe 1 or 2 questions, just because we're running a bit behind time. So I think we've got a question here from Kris. So she's asking, what kind of time frame are we looking at for seeing hydrogen generation realized and implemented?
Okay, the projects I'm working on at the moment are funded by BEIS on the hydrogen supply program. We are in the process of doing the front-end engineering design for a major hydrogen infrastructure within the locality. That's linked into the HyNet proposition, which Cadent Gas, the distribution network operator, has got in the local area. I think we will be injecting hydrogen into the grid within 3 to 4 years.
Oh, quite soon then.
Yes.
And I think maybe just one more question. What types of carbon capture storage are you working on?
Myself, I'm working on cryogenic carbon capture and storage. So that's the freezing out of carbon in industrial processes. But more importantly, the big project that I've been working on in terms of taking the carbon from the industries in the area and potentially moving it out into the East Irish Sea, the work that we've been leading on at Thornton Science Park has been around the modelling of those particular flows through the front-end engineering design that I was talking about earlier.
Really interesting. Thank you. Okay, so I think that's all the questions we have time for specifically for you, Joe. But hang around, don't go away. So now we'll be opening the questions for the entire panel to have a chance to answer. So again, only the presenters have access to the microphone and webcam. So if you can start sending your questions in the chat, and we'll read them out. And then if one of the panel members wants to take over and perhaps say your name again, because we won't be able to see you. And then we'll try and limit each question to 3 minutes so that we can get as many questions as possible in. So yes, if people want to start sending their questions in, I think we had quite a general question earlier, which I think I'll go back to from Erin, I believe. I'll just go back to that. So if the panel can all turn their microphones on, I suppose, or be ready to. So Erin asked, coronavirus has massively changed political priorities and will reduce both the amount of money and political willpower to tackle climate change on the necessary scale. How do we practically present ourselves to make sure that we act quickly, given there's no election till 2024 and the economy will be in turmoil while we're not sounding out of touch? So who wants to tackle that one first?
I'm happy to have a go. So the work that we're doing at the moment on this particular agenda, because it is an opportunity, is with the what we hope will be a clean growth budget in early July. And I know a number of us, and there's probably others on the panel, that have been lobbying government around that clean growth agenda. And so one of the things I do regularly, colleagues, is look at the business, energy and industrial strategy web pages, where they put out what they're doing day by day, and they put out calls for information, etc. So I've been throwing material into Rishi Sunak during the last few weeks. I've also been aligning myself with a new campaign group that's emerged over the last few weeks called Hydrogen Now, and help to pull together some of the major industries to lobby for the clean growth agenda, particularly the hydrogen agenda. And it's been fabulous. And running alongside that, recently there's been a lot of select committees begun to call for evidence. The one that I'm really engaged with is the Environmental Audit Committee's work on hydrogen, but also the all-party parliamentary groups as well. And I'm very much involved with the all-party parliamentary group on hydrogen. And we're all positioning ourselves for what will emerge post-COVID, hopefully through a clean growth budget.
Thank you, Joe. Does anyone else want to pick up on that?
Yeah.
Yeah, go
I gave a little written response in the chat, but it's a really good question because, yeah, coronavirus is going to probably massively reduce the budgets that local councils and government have access to, and of course it's changing people's priorities. But I don't think it's all negative. I think it's a mix. So while there are those downsides, we're seeing as local politicians that many people are recognizing that having less cars on the road is a good thing, that they are personally enjoying walking, cycling more, and they want to see better facilities so that they can carry on doing that after lockdown. People are noticing that the air in their area is much cleaner, and they want that to continue, especially because the emerging research, although caveated that it is all very new, so mostly not peer-reviewed yet, is showing that there is a link between air pollution and how bad your COVID symptoms are. There's also been lots of polling which has shown really remarkable, huge majority of people do not want to go back to society and the economy as it was before. They recognize the need for massive change, and that although none of us obviously wanted the coronavirus crisis to happen, a lot of people are recognizing now that the crisis has in some ways created opportunities for society to make big leaps in the way it does things in a way that we might not have been able to do in ordinary times. So I think that there are oh yeah, also of course lots of people working from home, lots of people learning that they don't need to fly all over the world every few weeks in order to conduct their work, and video conferences are actually quite easy. And also people concerned about the resilience of their food supply, and there's an increased push for more local food supplies. So I think that there are a lot of people whose eyes have been opened to these issues recently, and there's a lot of scope for capitalizing on those. And existing campaigns like campaign that a lot of political and non-political actors have been acting on, called the Green New Deal, and related campaigns called Build Back Better and Reset, have all been capitalizing on this idea of coming out of lockdown and building a new, better world for ourselves. So that's all stuff that individuals and politicians can be lobbying for without waiting for the next election to come around.
Yeah, that's quite optimistic. Thank you, Carla. Great answer. Kris, do you want to move on to the next question?
Yeah, we've actually got a question that sort of links to that one from Katie. As a green recovery has one of the best long-term economic multipliers post-COVID-19, what actions can we prioritize at a local level? And whoever's ready to take that one.
To dominate the best actions I think you can take, but I would say this, wouldn't I, is to work with local industries and to work with local employers to ensure that we embed sustainability practices and principles within those particular organizations as part of the clean growth recovery response, and those then will cascade down or cascade across to their employees. We also need to be working with local enterprise partnerships and local authorities around this particular agenda as well. And certainly that's something that excites me moving forward into a post-COVID recovery, is working alongside industry, academia and local authorities at the local agenda, and then all of us working with communities to get that outreach work, to get that knowledge out there to the outside world. Got to remember that for us within universities, our key client base is the 18 to 25-year-olds. So it's really important for us in terms of thinking about those future generations coming through. I'm conscious of time, guys, so I'll go quiet there.
Today's question, I think, from a local perspective, we're finding businesses are really positioning themselves quite differently. Their priorities are really changing, and what they're doing differently in particular is looking at local supply chains rather than their long supply chains from China. And yeah, that may cost more actually to potentially procure local goods, but equally when you think about the local environment, it's potentially creating new jobs. So I guess this is part of the overall clean growth recovery response that we could do locally.
So I think our next question comes from Jinghua. Sorry if I pronounced your name wrong. So she asked, what is the main strategy or approach to engage / communicate with the public to make behavior changes possible?
I usually have some opinions about this if I can.
Yeah, go for it.
I think the main thing, it's easy to make the mistake of thinking, especially when you haven't done that much public engagement, is thinking that more facts will help. And we know there's very clear evidence that more facts do not help, that actually just telling people more science is not the way to induce behavior change. And I think if I was to kind of summarize the 3 pillars that do help, one is trust. So people only basically accept information from people they trust. So one thing I've done to try and get trust with climate skeptics is to show trust, not as a climate scientist in itself, as an authority figure, but to show, for example, that I'm willing to be transparent in my papers and my code, or I'm willing to criticize papers publicly that I think are not very robust, or some other sort of indicator of trust. The second one is values. If people share your values, if you can show that you want the same things in life, I guess, then they listen to your message. And the third is looking for win-win situations, co-benefits, reasons to behave in a particular way that aren't just about the kind of moral, ethical dimension of climate change.
Anyone else want to pick up on that?
Yeah, is it all right if I hop in now as well?
Yeah, please do,
Great.
Carla.
Yeah, so I agree with everything Tamsin just said. And I would add, yeah, especially the more facts does not persuade people more. You might want to pepper one or two in there, but it's really important to get on people's emotional wavelength. And on that basis, in my experience, it's important for the person conveying the message to seem like a warm, likable person who is like you and relatable.
Yeah.
Very depressingly, you also, if it's written engagement, need to assume a very low reading age. So there's been loads of research that's been done on this in terms of political leaflets, which I appreciate is a bit different to behavior change. But for political leaflets, you have to, so like if I'm delivering a leaflet in the ward I represent, you have to assume a reading age of 9 years old. Doesn't mean that the average reading age in the UK is 9, although it is probably lower than all of you think. But that is a combination of people's reading age and people's attention span. How much attention they are capable of having, it's how much they are interested in giving to you when there's lots of other things going on in their life. So keeping things super simple, you know, if you can say something in 1 word rather than 5, do it. And finally, about behavior change specifically, something where I think we really need the arts to help us in this is painting a positive picture of the future. A lot of scientists and activists paint a picture of how it could all go wrong if we don't do the right thing, but we're not very good at elucidating what we're aiming for. And it's hard for people to change their behavior if they can't see the future that they are creating by doing that.
Yeah, absolutely. And can I just add one last thing that I put in the chat window earlier quickly, which is actually just to listen to people. You know, it's not just about talking at people, it's about trying to understand where they're coming from, what their priorities are, what's the sticking point.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just the young researchers really on the line. I'm as much for myself. I've been really struck, colleagues, by someone called Natasha Engel. And Natasha Engel, former Labour MP, deputy speaker at one stage, she moved on to become the shale gas czar 6 or 7 years ago, shale gas czar. And she's now following the sort of demise of shale gas, possibly thankfully within the UK. She's moved on to a position where she's now a partner in an organisation called Public First. And Public First are producing some fabulous material around citizen engagement in the future of sustainability across the UK and beyond, and how to engage with people and what works and what doesn't work, because she's clearly been in that role where she's done stuff that hasn't worked. So I'd really encourage colleagues, if you're interested in this agenda, to have a look at the Public First website.
Thank you, Joe. That sounds really useful. Definitely check that out. So moving on to the next question, I think. Kris?
Yep. So the next question is, the science regarding climate change is very clear on the threat that climate change poses, but action on tackling it can often lag behind. What do you feel is the best way for young scientists to make a difference in tackling climate change in terms of activism, public engagement, getting involved in policy, etc.?
I know I'm dominating almost. I'm sorry about that. I think there's 2 ways. Firstly, please stay in your roles and get involved in academia, talking, doing lectures, getting out into the local community, going to colleges, going to schools and doing those outreach STEM events. They're really, really important. And then secondly, again, I would encourage you to engage with industry if you've got the time, because it's industry which ultimately has access to government, which can release those significant funds from government or changes in policies, legislations, and the direction of their particular activities. And lastly, if I may, the third one, continue to write your young academics, get those papers out there in academic journals, but don't just leave them there, get them out into the trade press, get them out into the popular press as well.
Answer that?
Yeah, just following on, it's quite similar to Joe, really. I would definitely say networking. There's loads of opportunities for young researchers, students to be involved, even with the Chamber of Commerce, because they often have young groups. You know, to engage with charitable groups and councils as well, and definitely their professional bodies, because there is so much out there and there is so much you can do, and you're always full of brilliant ideas. You see things quite often in a different light. So I would go out there and say network, and engage as fully as you can.
I can maybe add. Sorry,
Go on, you first, Tamsin.
I was just going to say I could probably add something quick, which is to be kind of open-minded, really, about who you're talking to and where. You know, I think there's often an idea that kind of big businesses or big banks are kind of beyond the pale and beyond hope. But I've seen some really encouraging conversations with the general counsel lawyers inside businesses, basically who, you know, maybe for self-motivated reasons, but want to avoid being sued in 10 years for not tackling climate and sustainability now. So that idea of actually, you know, there's not the good people and the bad people here to try and, you know, change. It's everyone and everyone's kind of getting on board eventually.
Yeah, and to add to that, I don't know if I set a good example or not, because I obviously left engineering, and I felt like that was right for me, and so it might be right for some of the people listening, but it probably won't be for all of you. I felt like when I left engineering, it was because, well, I gave some of the reasons in my talk, but also, like, I'm an okay engineer, but I'm not an absolutely amazing one. There were definitely people in my team and my department who were better on the numbers and had a more intuitive grasp of what they were doing than I did. And so I felt like I wasn't adding as much extra value there. So I think you should be guided in what you do by a combination of what interests you and where you think you can add the most extra value. So you might be really good at explaining the science, in which case go into science communication, or you might be really good at like getting into the detail of it, in which case, you know, stay in academia. As I mentioned, I tried to get involved in policy consultancy, and I actually found that quite difficult to break into. And there was an expectation that you would have like a PPE or economics degree to get into that, which I found quite frustrating. So my personal experience is that that's an area where lots of scientists want to get into it, and actually there aren't as many jobs as there are people that want to do it. But maybe you'll be way better at it than me, so I don't want to put you off if that's your dream. And finally, kind of to second what Tamsin was saying there, I think there's room for us all to take all of the different tactics at the same time. In an emergency, we have to attack the emergency from every possible direction at once. We don't all pile into one solution. So, you know, there are going to be people that are doing activism. There's going to be people within large institutions changing them from the inside. There's room for all of those different tactics. I read an article a few years ago that really, really influenced me, called Tempered Radicals. And I've just Googled it quickly, and it looks like it might now be a book on Amazon, but I'm not 100% sure that's the same one. I'll check and type in the chat. But it talks all about the experience of being someone who's a radical pushing for change within quite an established organization, and how that at times quite uncomfortable tension is actually a really productive tension if you can put up with it.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much.
Okay, so if anyone has any more questions, you can write them in the chat box. Oh, we've just got one now, actually. What do you see as the UK's role in the global climate change policy discussion?
I can say something on the science side, which is just that, you know, I think we are seen as leaders on climate science itself. And I think we are seen as, you know, the other panelists will comment more on the, I think we are seen as leaders on policy. But, you know, I think we can use the kind of scientific and engineering strengths that we have as leverage, and we do. You know, our evidence base is strong, that feeds into the policy. I think we have a really a good kind of brand there, if you like.
Thank you, Tamsin. Perhaps Carla, from a political view?
This is a tricky question. I think my head is really in local government at the moment, so I'm not thinking as much of the UK-wide stuff. But I think the UK, I mean, as I touched on earlier, I think the UK is in a very privileged position compared to a lot of countries in the world. So in a large sense, it's our responsibility to lead and hope we have done. But then on the flip side, I want to say almost the exact opposite, which is I think Brits and the UK generally often have a tendency to assume that we're the best and that we know everything and that we don't have anything to learn from the other countries. So I hope that when the COP26 rescheduled one happens next year, the UK will lead that in a way that shares what it has, but also kind of leads by listening to others who know what they're talking about.
I agree. We are world leading. The whole research framework gets into that kind of mindset, I fear, within the UK. There's some fabulous work going on out there in the rest of the world, particularly I think in Southeast Asia, in Japan, in Korea, parts of China, down to Australia. That whole area, I think there's some fabulous work going on right now. But I think there's a position for the UK to take next year in its chairing of COP, and that's a great opportunity for us to sort of bring together some of the world leaders, and hopefully we will see some leadership from our Prime Minister at that particular event in driving forward the next 5 to 10 year agenda for the United Nations. I would encourage colleagues again to look at the Mission Innovation Agenda. There's some fabulous stuff coming out through the UN, through Mission Innovation on that, but also within our governments, the reformulated DFID and Foreign Office agenda is really important because of the funding that goes through there into international development and international trade, and then to ensure that that is closely aligned to the priorities that we've been talking about this afternoon.
Great. So we have run out of time. Thanks, everyone. That was a fantastic session. On behalf of the Royal Meteorological Society and all of our attendees, we'd like to say thank you for your time and presentations today. We hope you all enjoyed it as much as we did. And this is now going to bring our keynote session to an end. Panelists, thank you again. And to our attendees, we hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Goodness sakes. We'll see you at the quiz at 3:15.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.